Chapter 1. Khmer Empire. Consumed by water. The Khmer civilization did not rise from conquest alone, nor from trade or metallurgy, but from mastery over water. In a land governed by monsoon, extremes months of deluge, followed by months of drought, the ability to capture, store, distribute, and regulate water was not merely an economic advantage. It was the foundation of political authority, religious legitimacy, and cosmological order. Angkor was not simply a city. It was a hydraulic idea made monumental. To understand the Khmer Empire, one must abandon the intuition that empires expand primarily through armies. The Khmer expanded through infrastructure. Their power was expressed not first in walls or legions, but in reservoirs, barrages, canals, embankments, and spillways stretching across the floodplain. Control of water meant control of rice. Control of rice meant control of surplus, and surplus sustained temples, specialists, and kingship on a scale previously unseen in mainland Southeast Asia. Angkor's landscape was engineered to synchronize with the sky. The monsoon was not resisted, it was disciplined. Rainwater was slowed, redirected, absorbed, and released with precision. Massive reservoirs, such as the West Barrage, functioned not only as irrigation systems, but as symbols of cosmic order. In Khmer cosmology, the king stood at the center of the world, mirroring Mount Meru, with the surrounding waters representing the cosmic ocean. Hydraulic mastery thus fused material survival with metaphysical authority. This fusion defined Khmer kingship. The Devaraj, the god-king, was not divine by blood alone, but by capacity. His legitimacy rested on his ability to maintain balance between excess and scarcity, chaos and order. A failed harvest was not just an economic problem, it was a theological crisis. Water management was governance in its most literal form. The temples of Angkor reflect this logic. They were not isolated monuments, but nodes in a hydraulic network. Causeways doubled as dams. Moats regulated groundwater. Sacred geometry aligned architecture with cardinal directions, seasonal cycles, and celestial movements. Stone was the visible skin of a system whose true substance was water. To walk through Angkor was to walk through a diagram of controlled flow. Unlike many empires, the Khmer did not prioritize urban density. Angkor was sprawling, low density, and integrated with agriculture. The boundary between city and countryside was porous. Farmers lived among temples. Canals crossed ritual spaces. This integration allowed Angkor to support a population far larger than its built density would suggest. It also made the empire deeply dependent on ecological stability. Writing existed, but it was selective. Inscriptions recorded royal achievements, temple endowments, and religious dedications, not daily administration. Knowledge remained partly embedded in practice rather than text. Hydraulic expertise was transmitted through apprenticeship and labor, not manuals. This made the system adaptive, but also vulnerable to cumulative error. For centuries, the system worked. The Khmer Empire expanded westward and eastward, absorbing territories and peoples into its hydraulic political order. Rice yields sustained monumental construction on a breathtaking scale. Angkor became one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes in the world. From above, it resembled a woven fabric of water and land, engineered yet organic. Canals silted, embankments weakened, small failures propagated downstream. The very integration that enabled resilience also amplified fragility. When climate patterns shifted, bringing prolonged droughts punctuated by catastrophic floods, the system strained. Repairs became reactive rather than preventive. Authority weakened as failures accumulated. Populations dispersed. Administrative focus shifted south toward riverine trade routes. Temples were abandoned gradually, not violently. Stone endured, but the system that animated it dissolved. This raises a critical distinction. Angkor fell not because it was weak, but because it was too successful. Its scale locked it into assumptions about climate stability that no longer held. The empire consumed water with such precision that it left little margin for unpredictability. When variability replaced regularity, flexibility vanished. The Khmer case challenges simplistic narratives of decline. It was not moral decay, nor foreign invasion alone, nor technological stagnation. It was a mismatch between infrastructure and environment under changing conditions. A civilization optimized for balance was undone by imbalance. Yet this is only the beginning of the story. The Khmer did not disappear, they transformed. What remained after Angkor was not emptiness, but redistribution. New forms of settlement, religion, and power emerged, adapted to a different ecological and political reality. Water remained central, but no longer monumentalized. This chapter establishes the core paradox of the Khmer Empire, a civilization built on mastering nature, undone by nature's refusal to remain stable. Angkor stands today not as a ruin of hubris, but as evidence of an intelligence pushed beyond its ecological assumptions. The empire was not destroyed by enemies. It was consumed by water slowly, unevenly, and decisively. Chapter 2. Khmer Sacred Geometry and Hydraulic Power. Khmer power did not separate the sacred from the practical. Geometry, religion, and engineering formed a single language through which authority was expressed and maintained. Angkor's temples were not merely places of worship. They were instruments of governance, anchoring political order within cosmic space. To build in stone was to legislate in geometry. At the heart of Khmer cosmology stood Mount Meru, the axis of the universe. Every major temple complex was a terrestrial translation of this mythic center. Concentric enclosures, elevated towers, and surrounding moats mirrored the cosmic mountain rising from the primordial ocean. This was not metaphor alone, it was instruction. The landscape itself taught subjects where power resided and why it was legitimate. Water again served as mediator. Moats surrounding temples were not defensive but cosmological. They represented the cosmic sea and regulated groundwater simultaneously. Causeways aligned to cardinal directions ensured not only ritual procession but hydraulic flow. Sacred orientation doubled as engineering logic. The Khmer did not hide infrastructure underground, they ritualized it. This integration allowed the empire to scale its authority across space. Each temple established a local center of order, extending royal presence into the countryside. Inscriptions tied land, labor, and water rights to divine sanction. To maintain a canal was to fulfill religious duty. To neglect it was not inefficiency but impiety. The Beira reservoirs exemplified this synthesis. Vast artificial lakes required immense coordination. Their construction mobilized tens of thousands of laborers across seasons. Such projects were feasible only when belief aligned with necessity. The populace did not see waterworks as coercion alone, but as participation in cosmic maintenance. Hydraulic labor was sacred labor. Geometry disciplined both land and people. Rectilinear canals imposed predictability on floodplains. Orthogonal grids organized settlement patterns. Straight lines replaced meandering flows. This imposed order enhanced productivity but reduced flexibility. The landscape became legible but also rigid. Central authority benefited enormously. By positioning the king as the guarantor of balance, failures of infrastructure became failures of legitimacy. Success, conversely, reaffirmed divine kingship. Sacred geometry thus created a feedback loop. Water sustained rice. Rice sustained temples. Temples sustained belief. Belief sustained labor. And labor sustained water systems. Yet this loop depended on precision. Small misalignments accumulated, sedimentation altered gradients, repairs required continuous investment. Over time, geometry that once imposed harmony began to resist adaptation. Sacred layouts were difficult to modify without symbolic disruption. Infrastructure fossilized into ritual form. This rigidity reveals a deeper tension. Sacred geometry stabilized power but constrained response. When climate patterns shifted, the system's sanctity inhibited experimentation. To reroute water radically was to challenge cosmology itself. Engineering decisions became theological risks. The Khmer case thus complicates the idea of sacred architecture as mere expression. It functioned as operational code. Temples encoded hydrological assumptions. When those assumptions failed, the code could not easily be rewritten. Nevertheless, this fusion of geometry and power remains one of Angkor's most remarkable achievements. It demonstrates a civilization capable of thinking across scales cosmic, territorial, agricultural within a unified framework. Few societies have aligned belief, infrastructure, and authority so completely. The legacy persists. Even in ruin, Angkor's geometry continues to shape groundwater and settlement patterns. Modern Cambodia inherits a landscape still marked by ancient alignments. Sacred order, once embedded, does not vanish quickly. This chapter shows that the Khmer Empire was not sustained by belief or engineering alone, but by their inseparability. Sacred geometry made hydraulic power intelligible, enforceable, and meaningful. It also, paradoxically, made it brittle. The empire did not merely build with water, it believed with it. But a continuous terrain in which habitation, agriculture, ritual, and infrastructure merged seamlessly. To call Angkor an urban center in the conventional sense is to misunderstand its logic. It was a city that dissolved into its landscape. Civilization spread thinly across space, yet tightly integrated through flow. Most pre-modern cities concentrated people to concentrate power. Angkor dispersed people to concentrate control. Homes, fields, temples, ponds, and canals interwove across hundreds of square kilometers. There was no sharp boundary between urban and rural life. This spatial arrangement was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate strategy suited to monsoon ecology. Dense urbanism would have amplified flood risk and sanitation problems. Every field participated in drainage as well as production. The city itself became a hydraulic device. Angkor's population may have reached 1 million at its peak, yet it lacked the congestion typical of such numbers elsewhere. There was no distant hinterland feeding a parasitic center. Production and consumption were co-located. This organization relied on coordination rather than surveillance, without walls, gates, or tightly controlled streets. The king's authority thus extended not through constant presence, but through spatial design. To live within Angkor was to live within a system that structured behavior. Water schedules dictated labor rhythms, temple calendars synchronized communities, the landscape itself governed. When disruptions occurred, whether ecological or political, the diffuse system struggled to adapt quickly. The very openness that made Angkor resilient to small stresses made it vulnerable to large-scale shifts. Drought affected not just crops, but connectivity. This pattern complicates narratives of sudden collapse. When flow became erratic, concentration regained appeal. Cambodian rural settlement patterns still reflect dispersed habitation integrated with agriculture and water management. Ponds beside homes, fields shaped by microtopography, and communal labor rhythms echo ancient practice. The city dissolved, but its grammar endured. When environment and society intertwine to completely systemic risk increases, there is no external buffer. This chapter reveals Angkor not as a failed city, but as an experiment at the outer edge of ecological integration. It succeeded spectacularly under stable conditions and failed quietly when those conditions shifted. Its lesson is not one of hubris, but of design trade-offs. The city that was a landscape did not burn or fall. It faded its functions, redistributed, its spaces reclaimed, its logic migrating elsewhere. Civilization did not disappear. It changed shape. Chapter 4. Khmer Kingship. As environmental contract, Khmer kingship was not absolute command. It was conditional stewardship. Authority did not flow solely from lineage or conquest, but from an implicit contract between ruler, land, and people. The king ruled only so long as balance was maintained. In this sense, Khmer sovereignty was ecological before it was political. The concept of the Devaraja, the god-king, has often been misunderstood as simple divine absolutism. In practice, it imposed obligation as much as privilege. To embody the god was to guarantee order in the material world. Floods, droughts, crop failure, or infrastructural decay were not unfortunate accidents. They were signs of failed mediation. Nature itself functioned. This made Khmer rule unusually exposed. Success was visible and measurable. Reservoirs filled, canals flowed, rice yields stabilized, temples rose. When these indicators faltered, legitimacy eroded without the need for rebellion. Authority weakened quietly, losing coherence rather than being overthrown. Kingship, therefore, depended on continuous performance. Unlike empires grounded primarily in military dominance, the Khmer state could not retreat into force alone. Armies could suppress dissent, but they could not restore rainfall or repair silted channels at scale. Environmental failure undermined power more effectively than invasion. Ritual was the interface between governance and ecology. Ceremonies were not symbolic excess. They were mechanisms for synchronizing labor, belief, and seasonal timing. Royal rites marked planting cycles, canal openings, and temple consecrations. Through ritual, collective effort was mobilized and justified. To participate was to reaffirm the contract. This contract, however, assumed predictability. Monsoon rhythms had to remain within known bounds. Labor had to be available and compliant. Knowledge had to pass reliably across generations. As long as these conditions held, kingship functioned as an environmental regulator. Over time, strain accumulated. Maintenance demands grew as infrastructure aged and expanded. Each new reservoir required not only construction, but perpetual care. The system favored continuity over innovation. Altering major works risked cosmological disruption. Thus, adaptation lagged behind environmental change. When prolonged droughts struck, followed by intense floods, the contract began to fail. Ritual could not compel rain. Repairs could not keep pace with damage. This gradual disengagement explains the absence of dramatic collapse narratives. Kingship dissolved as relevance faded. New centers of power emerged along trade routes and river systems, where environmental risk was lower and mobility higher. The contract was renegotiated spatially rather than politically. Yet the idea of conditional rule persisted. Even after Angkor's decline, Cambodian political culture retained an expectation that authority must align with environmental and moral order. Power that fails to protect balance remains suspect. This legacy extends far beyond the empire itself. The Khmer experience reframes sovereignty as responsibility embedded in nature. It suggests that political authority, grounded in ecological competence, may be more stable and more fragile than authority, grounded in coercion alone. When nature cooperates, legitimacy is reinforced. When it does not, power dissolves. This chapter reveals why the Khmer Empire did not end in violent overthrow. Its kings were not toppled. They were rendered obsolete by imbalance. The contract expired. Chapter 5, Khmer Labor Obligation. And the weight of stone, the grandeur of Angkor, was not built by spectacle alone, but by obligation repeated over generations. Stone temples, vast reservoirs, and endless canals were the visible outcome of an invisible system of labor won, rooted not in wages or markets, but in duty. Khmer civilization was sustained by a moral economy in which work was both contribution and submission, necessity and belief. Labor in the Khmer world was not abstracted into contracts. It was embedded in social hierarchy and cosmology. To work on canals or temples was to participate in maintaining cosmic order. The king did not merely command labor, he activated it through ritual legitimacy. Obligation flowed downward from the sacred center, distributing effort across villages, seasons, and generations. This system enabled astonishing feats. Moving and setting massive stone blocks without iron tools or draft animals required coordination at scale. Canal excavation demanded synchronized seasonal labor aligned with monsoon rhythms. The absence of mechanization was compensated by social integration. People worked not because they were paid, but because the world they inhabited required it. Yet obligation accumulates weight. Each generation inherited not only land and belief, but unfinished maintenance. Stone decays slowly, water infrastructure does not. Canals silt annually, embankments weaken. Reservoirs demand constant dredging. What began as collective participation gradually hardened into burden. Crucially, the system lacked flexibility. Labor obligations were fixed by tradition and ritual precedent. Adjusting them required symbolic recalibration as much as administrative reform. When environmental stress increased, demands intensified precisely when capacity declined. The moral economy strained. Evidence suggests that by Angkor's later centuries, maintenance lagged behind expansion. New monuments rose even as older systems deteriorated. Stone construction, visible, legitimizing, was prioritized over less prestigious repair. This imbalance reflects a political logic. Monuments reaffirm authority immediately. Maintenance only prevents failure later. As pressures mounted, labor became extraction rather than participation. The line between obligation and coercion blurred. Communities at the periphery disengaged first, redirecting effort toward survival rather than imperial maintenance. The hydraulic system, dependent on full participation, began to fragment. This fragmentation was quiet. There were no mass revolts recorded in stone. Instead, canals were left uncleared, fields reverted to seasonal flooding, villages relocated incrementally, labor withdrew its consent, the temples remained. Stone outlasted people. Later observers mistook this for sudden collapse, powerful civilization inexplicably abandoned. In reality, it was labor that left first. Without hands to maintain flow, the system lost coherence. This reveals a central paradox of Khmer civilization. Its greatest strength, collective obligation, was also its greatest vulnerability. When belief aligned with environment, labor sustained empire. When that alignment broke, obligation became unsustainable. The lesson is structural rather than moral. Systems built on unpaid, ritualized labor achieve scale cheaply, but depend absolutely on legitimacy and stability. When either falters, there is no buffer. Collapse does not announce itself. It arrives as absence. By the time Angkor's stone towers stood empty, the empire had already dissolved in practice. Labor had voted with its feet. Chapter 6: Khmer, Climate, Stress, and the Failure of Prediction. The Khmer Empire did not lack intelligence. It lacked foresight for instability. Its systems were calibrated with extraordinary precision, but for a climate assumed to be regular. For centuries, the monsoon behaved within tolerable bounds. The hydraulic network was optimized for this rhythm. It could absorb variation, but only within a known range. Khmer engineering assumed that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to plan for it. Paleoclimate evidence now suggests that this assumption began to break down in the 14th and 15th centuries. Extended droughts interrupted planting cycles. Then, when rains returned, they arrived violently, overwhelming embankments, eroding canals, and depositing massive sediment loads. Infrastructure designed to regulate flow was instead exposed to extremes it was never meant to handle. This exposed a structural weakness. The system was predictive, not adaptive. It managed known variability efficiently, but struggled with novelty. Reservoirs could store water, but not uncertainty. Canal gradients could direct flow, but not sudden excess. Once thresholds were crossed, damage cascaded. Repair required rapid coordination across the entire network. But coordination depended on authority, labor availability, and belief in eventual recovery. As failures repeated, confidence eroded. Each repair became a gamble rather than an assurance. Maintenance transformed from routine to crisis management. Crucially, Khmer governance lacked mechanisms for radical redesign. Sacred geometry constrained alteration. Political legitimacy discouraged admission of systemic failure. Incremental fixes were preferred over structural rethinking. This delayed adaptation until costs became prohibitive. Climate stress thus translated into political stress. Reduced harvests strained surplus. Surplus funded temples, rituals, and labor mobilization. As surplus declined, the state's ability to respond weakened. Feedback loops turned negative. The empire was not blind to change. It was slow to reconfigure. Its intelligence was retrospective. When cycles broke, experience became an unreliable guide. This distinguishes Khmer decline from simple environmental determinism. Climate did not destroy Angkor directly. It exposed the limits of a system optimized for stability in a world becoming unstable. Failure lay in prediction, not engineering skill. Eventually, adaptation occurred but spatially rather than systemically. Power shifted toward riverine trade networks less dependent on fixed infrastructure. Mobility replaced monumentality. The old system was not repaired, it was bypassed. The Khmer mastered water, but they could not master uncertainty. Chapter 7. Khmer withdrawal without ruin. The end of Angkor was not a catastrophe witnessed in flames or conquest. It was a withdrawal gradual, uneven, and largely invisible to those not living through it. The Khmer Empire did not fall apart. It thinned, shifted, and relocated. What disappeared was concentration, not civilization. Archaeological layers show continuity rather than abandonment. Temples were not destroyed, they were left. Canals were not violently breached, they were neglected. Forest reclaimed stone slowly, not abruptly. This pattern suggests choice under constraint rather than sudden defeat. As hydraulic systems became unreliable, the cost of remaining within the Angkorian landscape increased. Maintenance demanded labor no longer justified by returns. Communities recalculated. Survival favored proximity to navigable rivers, trade routes, and flexible water access. The center lost its advantage. Political authority followed population. Courts moved southward toward the Mekong and Tonle Sap systems, where seasonal flooding was predictable and commerce offered alternative surplus. Rice was no longer the sole foundation of power. Trade, mobility, and taxation diversified it. This transition was not ideological. There was no rejection of Angkor's cosmology. Rather, the material basis that sustained it no longer held. Sacred geography lost relevance when it could not guarantee sustenance. Withdrawal was pragmatic. Importantly, this shift avoided large-scale social trauma because the empire lacked rigid urban cores and enclosed populations. People could leave without siege or famine. The very openness of Angkor enabled its dispersal. Collapse was cushioned by design. Later observers misread ruins as evidence of sudden collapse. In reality, ruins marked places no longer worth maintaining, not places destroyed. The Khmer did not lose knowledge, they changed priorities. The empire dissolved into its successor, leaving stone behind as residue. The forest did not erase Angkor, it received it. Chapter 8. Khmer Memory, carried by practice. When Angkor ceased to function as an imperial center, it did not cease to exist in memory. What vanished was monumentality as a living system, not the civilizational logic that had produced it. Khmer memory did not rely on archives or continuous stone construction. It survived through practice. Civilization, once again, outlived its visible form. The departure from Angkor did not entail cultural amnesia. Agricultural techniques, water management at smaller scales, ritual calendars, and social obligations persisted. What had been imperial infrastructure fragmented into local systems. Ponds replaced reservoirs, dikes replaced canals, household practice replaced state coordination. Memory scaled down without dissolving. This transition reveals an important distinction between knowledge and system. The Angkorian system required central coordination and massive labor. The knowledge that animated it, how water behaves, how rice responds to timing, how labor synchronizes with seasons, could survive without empire. Once released from monumental scale, it became more flexible. Ritual played a central role in this continuity. Even as great temples fell silent, smaller shrines remained active. Buddhism, increasingly dominant, absorbed and reframed older cosmological ideas. Ancestor veneration and landscape reverence persisted, now expressed with less architectural ambition but greater portability. Belief became lighter, easier to carry. Oral transmission replaced inscription as the primary medium of memory. Stories shifted focus from kings and monuments to morality, suffering, and endurance. The past was no longer celebrated as grandeur, but remembered as instruction. What mattered was not what had been built, but what had been learned. Everyday practices encoded Angkor invisibly. The placement of villages near water sources, the shaping of fields, the timing of planting and harvest all carried echoes of imperial knowledge. These habits did not announce their origin. They worked, and therefore they remained. This mode of memory resisted erasure. Colonial powers could appropriate ruins, but they struggled to control practice. French scholars mapped Angkor and restored temples, yet the living continuity of Khmer civilization resided elsewhere in rural life, seasonal rhythms, and communal labor. Civilization survived outside the gaze of power. Memory carried by practice also proved adaptive. Detached from sacred geometry and centralized authority, it could evolve. New crops, new tools, and new social forms integrated gradually. The civilizational core balance with water and land remained intact even as expressions changed. Angkor thus became a reservoir of symbolic memory rather than operational guidance. It reminded, but it did not dictate. The forest-covered temples stood as caution rather than command. Grandeur gave way to restraint. This chapter reframes decline as redistribution of memory. Civilization did not shatter, it diffused. What could not be maintained at scale survived in fragments strong enough to endure. The Khmer did not forget Angkor. They learned how to live without it. Chapter NINE, Khmer. When the archive arrived too late, when foreign observers finally encountered Angkor in the modern era, they mistook rediscovery for revelation. The temples seemed abandoned, swallowed by forest, frozen in time. To the archival mind, this meant loss. To the Khmer world, it meant something else entirely. The civilization had already moved on. The archive arrived too late. Colonial archaeology approached Angkor as a dead object. French scholars mapped, catalogued, restored, and interpreted the ruins through texts, measurements, and classifications. Stone was stabilized. Names were fixed. Chronologies imposed. Angkor entered global history but as past, not as continuity. This archival encounter created a profound distortion. Civilization was equated with monuments, survival with preservation. What lay outside stone living practice, rural knowledge, adaptive memory was rendered invisible. The Khmer were positioned as descendants of a lost greatness rather than participants in an ongoing one. The archive freezes. It demands closure, origin, and endpoint. Angkor resisted all three. Its decline had no single date. Its knowledge had no single author. Its memory had no single repository. By the time writing attempted to contain it, the civilization had already redistributed itself into forms the archive could not easily hold. This mismatch shaped modern narratives. Angkor became a symbol of rise and fall, warning against hubris or environmental mismanagement. These interpretations were not false, but they were incomplete. They privileged what failed over what endured. Even restoration carried paradox. Reassembled temples created an illusion of permanence that had never existed. Angkor was never static. It was always under construction, repair, and adaptation. To restore it as fixed form was to misunderstand its nature. The archive preserved appearance while losing process. Meanwhile, Khmer society continued to negotiate water, labor, belief, and survival under new pressures: colonial extraction, war, displacement, modern development. None of this fit neatly into the Angkorian narrative. The civilization was alive, but the archive spoke only of ruins. This chapter exposes the violence of belated recognition. When acknowledgement comes only after function has ended, it redefines living systems as heritage. It honors them safely once they no longer challenge dominant models. Angkor's tragedy is not that it was forgotten, but that it was remembered incorrectly. The archive mistook silence for absence, ruin for end. The Khmer civilization did not need to be rediscovered. It needed to be seen where it still lived. Chapter 10. Khmer Survival After Monumentality. When Angkor ceased to function as an imperial machine, Khmer civilization entered a different mode of existence, one no longer anchored in stone or scale. Survival after monumentality required a recalibration of values. Grandeur was no longer viable. Adaptability was. What endured was not the capacity to build massively, but the capacity to live intelligently within constraint. Post-Angkorian Khmer society reorganized around smaller, more flexible units. Villages replaced temple complexes as centers of coordination. Authority became localized, negotiated through kinship, monastic networks, and pragmatic leadership rather than cosmic kingship. Buddhism, particularly Theravada traditions, provided an ethical framework suited to this decentralization. Merit replaced monument, practice replaced display. Water management did not disappear, it miniaturized. Large reservoirs gave way to ponds, seasonal wetlands, and riverine reliance. These systems lacked the spectacle of Angkor, but offered resilience. They could be abandoned, repaired, or reconfigured with far less cost. Risk was distributed rather than concentrated. This shift altered social psychology. Where Angkor demanded participation in a vast, impersonal system, post-imperial life emphasized sufficiency and continuity. Survival no longer depended on maintaining cosmic order at scale, but on navigating uncertainty locally. The loss of monumentality reduced vulnerability. Importantly, this was not regression, it was strategic simplification. Knowledge was preserved by shedding forms that had become liabilities. Khmer civilization chose durability over dominance. Colonial and modern observers often misread this as decline. Smaller temples, wooden structures, and dispersed settlements appeared as poverty rather than choice. Yet these forms aligned more closely with ecological realities and historical trauma. A civilization that had learned the cost of overextension adapted quietly. The 20th century imposed new pressures: colonial extraction, war, genocide, modernization, but Khmer survival drew upon deep reserves of adaptive memory. Practices honed after Angkor proved crucial. Flexibility, communal resilience, and moral continuity enabled endurance where rigid systems would have failed. Monumentality, once lost, was never reclaimed at scale. Angkor remained unique, not because its descendants lacked capacity, but because they no longer sought it. Stone was allowed to stand as reminder rather than model. This chapter reframes survival as selective inheritance. Civilization does not persist by carrying everything forward. It persists by choosing what to release. After monumentality, the Khmer endured not diminished, but recalibrated. Chapter 11. Khmer, when the center could no longer hold. By the 14th century, Angkor was no longer a city expanding outward. It had become a system struggling to remain coherent. What had once been its greatest strength, scale, integration, and hydraulic centralization, now imposed a crushing inertia. The center still stood, but it no longer commanded unquestioned gravity. This was not collapse in the dramatic sense favored by chronicles. No single invasion ended Angkor. No decisive battle erased its kings. Instead, the empire entered a long phase of structural exhaustion, where institutions designed for abundance proved brittle under scarcity and change. At the heart of this exhaustion lay overextension. For centuries, Angkor's political order assumed that the center could always mobilize labor, extract surplus, and enforce ritual obedience across vast distances. Temples were built farther from the core. Canals stretched longer, demanding constant maintenance. The sacred geography of the empire expanded until it became administratively unmanageable. When disruptions occurred, whether from climatic instability, regional rebellion, or shifting trade routes, the response mechanisms lagged. The system was optimized for continuity, not adaptation. Climate stress intensified this rigidity. Prolonged droughts reduced the reliability of reservoirs. Sudden, violent monsoons damaged embankments faster than they could be repaired. Maintenance failures compounded. A canal neglected for one season could undermine an entire agricultural district the next. But environmental stress alone does not explain Angkor's weakening. Civilizations do not fail because nature changes. They fail because their institutions cannot reinterpret reality quickly enough. The Khmer political theology had little room for such reinterpretation. The God-King was not accountable to circumstance. His legitimacy rested on cosmic alignment, not pragmatic explanation. When water systems faltered, the ideology offered no language of era-only silence or denial. The king could not admit miscalculation without unraveling the metaphysical basis of rule. As hydraulic certainty declined, so too did faith in centralized authority. Local elites began to assert greater autonomy. Temple patronage shifted away from Angkor's core toward regional centers. Power, once concentrated through monumental ritual, diffused through networks of monasteries, merchants, and provincial rulers. This diffusion coincided with a profound ideological transformation, the rise of Theravada Buddhism. Unlike the state-centered, temple-heavy Hindu-Mahayana synthesis of earlier Angkor, Theravada Buddhism emphasized personal merit, monastic simplicity, and local religious life. It required fewer grand monuments, fewer state rituals, and less centralized control. In embracing Theravada, Khmer society did not reject spirituality, redefined authority. The sacred moved inward. Salvation no longer required royal mediation. The king, once the axis between heaven and earth, became morally ordinary. This quiet revolution eroded the symbolic necessity of Angkor itself. At the same time, regional trade patterns shifted. Maritime routes gained prominence as inland agrarian dominance waned. Coastal polities and riverine hubs closer to the Mekong Delta grew more relevant than the monumental but inland capital. Power followed commerce, not stone. Angkor, built to command land and water, found itself peripheral to a world increasingly oriented toward the sea. Importantly, none of this required abandonment. People did not flee Angkor en masse. Instead, they reallocated significance. The city lost its inevitability. The center ceased to be the only imaginable center. By the 15th century, royal courts relocated southward. Angkor remained inhabited, cultivated, and revered, but no longer imperial. It became memory rather than command. What makes this moment historically significant is not that Angkor fell, but that it failed to adapt its own success. Its systems had solved the problems of one era so thoroughly that they blinded the civilization to new realities. Angkor teaches that dominance achieved through integration carries a paradox. The more unified a system becomes, the harder it is to reconfigure. Flexibility often belongs to the periphery, not the center. In this sense, the end of Angkor was not a tragedy imposed from outside. It was the logical consequence of a civilization that had mastered order but misunderstood resilience. The stones remained, the canals endured in fragments, the people continued. What vanished was certainty, the belief that history must always flow through the same channels. In the final chapter, we will confront the afterlife of Angkor, how a civilization that lost its center nonetheless survived through dispersion, adaptation, and inheritance, and why Khmer identity today is inseparable from a city that no longer rules, yet never truly disappeared. Chapter 12. Khmer, the civilization that learned to leave its capital. Civilizations are often remembered by their capitals. When the capital falls, history is tempted to declare an ending. Yet Angkor complicates this instinct. What followed its political decentralization was not disappearance, but dispersion, a rare historical outcome in which a civilization survives by abandoning the very form that once defined it. To leave a capital without losing oneself is an uncommon achievement. After the 15th century, Angkor ceased to function as the gravitational center of Khmer power. Royal courts moved southward, closer to the Mekong and the maritime trade networks reshaping Southeast Asia. Administrative authority fragmented, monumental construction slowed, and eventually stopped. To an external observer, this appeared as decline. Internally, however, something subtler occurred. Khmer civilization shed its architectural core, but retained its cultural skeleton. The shift was not abrupt. Angkor remained populated for generations. Farmers continued to cultivate fields shaped by ancient canals. Monks maintained temples, though with fewer resources. Pilgrims still walked the causeways. What changed was not habitation, but expectation. Angkor was no longer assumed to be the inevitable center of Khmer existence. This psychological decentering mattered more than any physical abandonment. Theravada Buddhism, now fully integrated into Khmer society, provided the ethical framework for this transition. Unlike earlier state-centric religious systems, Theravada did not require monumental validation. Merit was accumulated through conduct, not construction. Authority rested with monastic communities embedded in villages, not with god-kings elevated above them. Religion, once fused to empire, became portable. This portability allowed Khmer identity to to survive geographic reorientation. As political centers shifted, cultural continuity flowed through language, ritual, agricultural practice, and memory. The civilization no longer needed a singular monumental axis to confirm its coherence. Angkor, in this new configuration, became something else, a repository rather than a regulator. The ruins functioned as a mnemonic landscape of vast archive in stone and water. They reminded later generations of a time when order had been imposed on nature at an unprecedented scale. But they no longer dictated how life should be organized. Memory replaced command. This transformation challenges linear models of civilizational rise and fall. Angkor did not collapse into oblivion like some abandoned cities of the ancient world, nor did it persist unchanged. It entered a third state, symbolic persistence, without political centrality. Few civilizations have managed this transition. The hydraulic systems that once underwrote imperial authority continued to shape rural life. Rice cultivation patterns inherited from Angkor endured, even as maintenance became localized and adaptive rather than centralized. Where the empire had once sought uniform control, communities now practiced selective preservation. What survived was not the system, but its usable fragments. Colonial encounters, centuries later, further altered Angkor's meaning. European rediscovery in the 19th century reframed the city as a lost wonder, a spectacle of vanished grandeur. This external gaze froze Angkor in time, emphasizing ruin over continuity. Yet for Khmer people, the site was never truly lost. It had always existed within lived geography and oral memory. The difference lay in interpretation, not presence. In the modern Cambodian state, Angkor occupies a paradoxical role. It is simultaneously national symbol, tourist economy, spiritual site, and historical burden. It represents greatness, but also reminds the present of impermanence. It inspires pride, yet warns against overreach. This duality is its final lesson. Angkor teaches that civilization is not identical with dominance. Power may require concentration, but survival often depends on diffusion. When centralized systems harden, they risk shattering under change. When cultures learn to decentralize meaning, they gain resilience. The Khmer did not preserve Angkor by maintaining it as a capital. They preserved it by allowing it to become memory. In doing so, they avoided a fate common to imperial civilizations, being trapped by their own past. Angkor did not dictate the future, it informed it. The civilization learned to carry itself without dragging its monuments behind it. Seen from this perspective, Angkor's legacy is not failure, but adaptation at civilizational scale. It stands as evidence that endurance does not always belong to those who hold the center longest, but to those who recognize when the center has become a liability. To leave a capital voluntarily, or at least without civilizational ruptures, to accept that history flows. Like water, toward new basins. The Khmer once mastered water by fixing it into channels. Later, they mastered survival by letting history flow freely. That is why Angkor still matters. Not because it ruled, but because it taught a civilization how to remain itself after rule had ended. Conclusion: the quiet continuity of Khmer civilization, the story of the Khmer, is not a tale of rise and ruin, but of transformation without erasure. Angkor stands today not as the tomb of a civilization, but as its most visible memory stone, holding the shape of an idea that long ago learned to let go of power. What endured was never the city itself, but the capacity to adapt when the city could no longer command history. Khmer civilization survived by doing what empires rarely manage, separating identity from domination. When monumentality became a burden, it was abandoned. When centralized certainty failed, meaning dispersed into villages, monasteries, rituals, and language, the civilization did not insist on continuity of form, only continuity of essence. In this lies Angkor's deepest lesson. Civilizations do not vanish when capitals fall. They vanish when they mistake structure for soul. The Khmer avoided this fate by allowing history to move on without demanding that it move through the same channels forever. Angkor remains silent, immense, unresolved, not as proof of lost greatness, but as evidence that survival can be quieter than conquest. It reminds us that the most enduring civilizations are not those that hold power the longest, but those that know when to release it and how to remain whole afterward.